It's good to see y'all. Thanks for being here on a cold night, on a night where there's snow out there. It's hard to walk. We're just absolutely thrilled to have this event. We've got about 200 folks here in person. There's still a bunch of folks in the lobby kind of filing in, trying to get parking. And we have over 300 of you online. And so if you're watching from all over the country, from California to Georgia to Maine, we're just really excited that you're here too. This evening, we've gathered an illustrious group of journalists and scholars to discuss white Christian nationalism and the future of American democracy. We're, of course, having this discussion in the wake of the 2022 midterms, and the election results were not as bad for American democracy as many of us feared. If you listen to Straight White American Jesus, we've talked about this for hours and hours on end. However, we saw this election cycle, many candidates run on Christian nationalist platforms. They use language rife with spiritual warfare motifs, authoritarian language, threats to marginalized communities, and the open embrace of a Christian nationalist identity. Candidates like Doug Mastriano and Carrie Lake did not win, and I know we're recording this, and so I'll just say I think that's a good thing. Other candidates like Ron DeSantis and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, whose opponent Adam Frisch just conceded today, did win, and they are those who have either employed the rhetoric I talked about or openly embraced that Christian nationalist identity. So our goal this evening is to discuss the contours of white Christian nationalism, how it threatens democracy and American freedoms. And we also want to talk a little bit about what it looked like on the ground during these midterms and what it might look like going forward, especially as the 2024 election cycle looms. So here's how it's going to go. We're going to have our first panel. It's going to run for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have 15 or 20 minutes for questions. We'll have time for folks in the audience here in Denver and all of you online to definitely jump in. So no matter where you're participating from, you'll be able to be part of the conversation. After a 10-minute intermission, we'll regather and we'll repeat that process with our second panel. I want to make sure before we do any of this, though, to thank a lot of people who made this happen, a lot of moving parts. So first, you're going to hear from him in a minute, is my co-host Dan Miller, who does the show with me every week, is my work husband for sure, and is somebody that I'm just really glad to be married to professionally in the way we are. The other one is Sarah Mosliner, who is a big part of our show and who will be on the first panel with me. And Sarah has worked tirelessly behind the scenes with me. We've been talking about this since August, and very simply, this would not have happened without Sarah. She's amazing, and if you have a chance, say thanks to her or buy her a beer or something else. A lot of folks here at the University of Denver who really made this happen. Dr. Sandra Dixon's here, who is the chair of the Religious Studies Department and somebody who just helped us find this venue and get everything set so this could happen. Dr. Deepa Sundaram also was the first one that said, hey, maybe we could do that here at the University of Denver, and we talked through it. We have an amazing set of sponsors. You've been seeing their logos on the screen here, but I just want to say thank you to them. American Atheists, Broadleaf Books, Auburn Seminary, the CAP Center for Religion and Public Life at UCSB, the Baptist Joint Committee, and the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. We really appreciate your help and your partnership. Other than that, there are a couple of folks upstairs who have been helping us all night, Cortland Coffey and Megan Crozier and Josh Scott, as well as Maria Hearing, and just thankful for them too. There's a lot more people to thank, including all of you who are here and are making this happen, those of you who spread the word and encouraged others. We've got people who drove in from Tulsa, so we're excited you made it. We got people who flew in from Pittsburgh. We got folks who flew in from Texas. So appreciate y'all. It's amazing to get to share this space with you. Before we bring out our first panel, I want to turn it over to Dan Miller, who's going to set a baseline for the conversation and talk to us a little bit about white Christian nationalism and what we mean by that. So Dan.
Hello. I want to echo Brad and just saying how excited we are to have everybody here. He plays down his role a little bit. As he said, he and Sarah really did a lot of this, but Brad was a real driving force, so just couldn't do it without him. I have been tasked with the task of trying to lay sort of a 2 to 3 minute description of Christian nationalism and what we might mean by that. So nothing can go wrong with that. And so we'll see how it goes. And again, to echo what Brad said, we're really excited to be here. It's sort of, I guess, not excited to be here talking about Christian nationalism. It would be great if that just sort of went away and we didn't need to talk about it. But we're excited to talk about that, Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism. It's one of the topics that'll come up tonight, as he said, with a tremendous slate of speakers. And so if we just pause for a minute and say, well, what is that? What is white Christian nationalism? It is a breed of populist nationalism, 2 50-cent words that we could spend a lot of time discussing in their own right. But I think for us tonight, it's enough to say that American nationalism and populism come together in the conviction that only members of the true or authentic American people are real Americans. What does that mean? Why does it matter? It matters because within that framework, not all residents of the U.S., not even all U.S. citizens, not even all natural-born U.S. citizens are real Americans. To be counted as a real American requires something more than residence or citizenship. While all U.S. citizens, to say nothing of non-citizen residents, might possess a kind of nominal civic identity, and they might be legally entitled to basic rights and a level of political recognition, for Christian nationalists, real Americans are a much more exclusive subset of people within the U.S. population. Stated most simply, Christian nationalism takes shape around the conviction that the U.S. is or ought to be a Christian nation. But that conviction is more complex than it might seem. And the reason for this is because Christian nationalism isn't limited to typical measures of Christian identity, such as the acceptance of traditionally Orthodox Christian beliefs, or the frequency of church attendance, or scripture reading, or prayer, or those kinds of things. Rather, in common with all nationalist identities, Christian nationalism is a complex social formation. And while we often draw analytic distinctions between different dimensions of identity like race and ethnicity and gender and sexuality, the reality is that lived national identities tend to be sort of package deals in which multiple axes of identity come together in clear and pretty predictable ways. So while Christian nationalist sense of Christian identity may be tied to some degree to those traditional measures of Christian adherence, it's also integrally connected to other dimensions of identity. So who are these real Americans imagined within Christian nationalism? Studies of Christian nationalism from a lot of different directions, they yield a surprisingly consistent profile of that imaginary real American. Real Americans are white, they are cisgender, they are heterosexual, they are Protestant, they are English speaking, they are US born, they are of Northern European descent, they are affirmative of patriarchy, if not male themselves, and it is worth adding they are politically and socially conservative. That doesn't mean for Christian nationalists that people of color or immigrants can't be here. But it does mean that they need to know their place within the social and political hierarchies and expect to be disciplined by way of law or violence if they disrupt the American way of life. Within this perspective, a Christian nation is one in which the right kind of Americans, real Americans, this kind of American, hold a monopoly on cultural and social and political capital, which is why we are also here to talk about the future of American democracy. Because as Christian nationalists have vividly demonstrated in recent years, the conviction that America is a Christian nation licenses the imposition of that vision at any cost. One of the issues we'll discuss tonight is the growing sentiment that democracy is not a sacred value for white Christian nationalists. If democracy has to be martyred or beheaded at a guillotine outside the Capitol, so be it. It's worth it to save the nation. Naturally, there is significant and legitimate debate about the contours and the features and the scope of Christian nationalism, debate which I think tonight's participants will help us explore. But I hope this at least gives us a brief outline of what we can think of as a common reference point for the discussions that follow. And I, like all of you, am excited to see what emerges from tonight's conversation. So having said that, the exciting Christian nationalist preamble, please join me in welcoming our first panel moderated by Annika Brock-Schmidt.
I'm gonna blame them.
All right, welcome to the first panel of the first ever live event of the Straight White American Jesus podcast. I'm glad to see you're all here. My name is Annika Brockschmidt, and I'm very honored to be here and to be able to introduce you to our amazing guests. Catherine Stewart is a journalist and the author of The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Dr. Robert P. Jones is the president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute and author of White Too Long: The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And then we have Dr. Sarah Mosliner. You've already heard about her. She's a professor in CMU's Department of Philosophy and Religion and the author of Virgin Nation: Sexual Purity and American Adolescence. And then, of course, I don't think I have to introduce him, but I will still do it. We have Dr. Brad Onishi. He is faculty at the University of San Francisco and the author of the upcoming book, Preparing for War: The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. So I would say, let's dive straight in. Robbie, I see people refer to both Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism. Beyond the demographics and the data that tells us that this is primarily white people who embrace Christian nationalism, why would you say it's necessary to explicitly call it white Christian nationalism?
Great. Well, it's an important question, and thank you, Brad, for inviting me. Glad to be here. And I think it's important. It's really about history and context. I think in the U.S., if we were in India, if we were in Burma, if we were somewhere else, we'd be talking about something else, right? But I think in the U.S., it's important to really name our history. When you think back, some of the earliest European contact gives us this image, right? So if you think about those old paintings you see of De Soto, of Cartier, of Cabot, what you see, you could probably conjure it up in your mind, is this planting of a flag, a European flag, and this planting of a cross, a huge cross in most cases. And those were usually done right either at a foot of a river or at the outskirts of a Native American village. And it was a way of claiming the land for a European political power and for Christianity. And that blend, really, of Christianity and colonialism was the version of Christianity that landed on these shores, right? And it's morphed and taken various terms. But I think one way of thinking about this is that white Christian nationalism, I think, is a descriptive term for a contemporary expression of a very, very old problem in the US. And it's one that really been with us, as I said, from the beginning. We're talking like 15th century, from the beginning. As it's come up through our history. So I think in this place, on these lands, when we're talking about Christian nationalism, we really do, I think, need to talk about it as an ethno-religious movement that has its roots in this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery, which Native American scholars have been talking to us for a long time about, but it's just making its way into, I think, more mainstream circles. But it really is this idea that God intended these lands to be a kind of new promised land for European Christians. And in fact, when we've asked people about that, I'll close on this point, we asked people about that in surveys, we kind of put that in a survey question. We find that while twice as many Americans reject that as accept it, but 31% of Americans will affirm that statement, that God intended America to be a new promised land for European Christians. Like, that's the idea. And when you look at who affirms it, it's overwhelmingly white groups. So half of Republicans, a group that, by the way, is 70% white and Christian. So half of Republicans affirm that statement, half of white evangelical Protestants affirm that statement. And it's also linked, that's the other, I think, thing, that in white circles, it is linked to violence. And so, for example, the people who affirm that statement are 4 times as likely as those who do not, to say that true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country today.
Right, and I think we're going to stay with the sort of ethno-nationalist aspect of white Christian nationalism. Sarah, at the Yale conference on white Christian nationalism, author Jeff Charlotte noted that white Christian nationalism as a fascist movement is, quote, an innocence cult, it is innocent of history. Can you explain to us where sort of conceptions and ideas of both innocence and purity can be found in white Christian nationalism, and why they are so essential to understanding this phenomenon?
Yeah, so I think about the construction of white racial identity quite a bit. I teach on it, and so it has a history. And Robert just sort of laid the foundations of that history. And of course, it's been really remarkable to see the conversations that have emerged around whiteness since the racial uprisings. This has been stuff that I've been studying for almost 20 years now, and I never had anyone to talk to about it. So it's been interesting to be like, now everyone's talking about it. Okay. But what I've come to see is that, whiteness has always been associated, in this place, right, that our settler colonial nation, with innocence, right? It was codified. I think of going back to the Virginia slave codes in, oh, great, yeah, I'm a historian. Every historian will tell you we're terrible with dates. So Virginia slave codes in the colonial period, where they distinguished between European slaves and slaves of African descent. And they gave European slaves the opportunity to work out of their enslavement, but if you were of African descent, you were a perpetual slave. And in codifying that in the law, it created these racial categories of black and whiteness being associated with freedom, with innocence, and blackness being associated with servitude and an inability to self-govern. And so I think the innocence that is connected to white racial identity has been this, my colleague Monique Moultrie used this term, a delusion, right? It's just become this perpetual delusion that has worked really well in terms of giving white people a sense of specialness, a sense of, oh, we have something in common with one another. And unfortunately, and what it does, we see this now, especially with the debates over critical race theory, is that when we get to a place where we're having national conversations about the racist history of the United States, people, can I swear? Just
Go right ahead.
people are losing their shit, right? If you've been to a school board meeting in the last year, right? And so because there is this sense that, we are innocent of all of these things. And white Christian nationalism says, well, this was all part of God's plan. So it's, yes, it was hard, but we got over it. We do the right thing now. And so that's all justified, right? Rather than actually doing the hard work of reckoning with that innocence. And I know there's a question in purity culture as well, but we can come back to that if we just want to stay on the whiteness piece.
I'll happily do that. Let's maybe for the moment jump sort of back into the present time. You've already noted the school board meetings that I think many of us have seen videos of or have had the pleasure of being at maybe. Catherine, how would you say, how have politicians these days been using white Christian nationalism as a campaign strategy, especially given the outcomes of the midterms? Do you think white Christian nationalism will continue to be a constant feature of American politics?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. And I think in order to see how this is used as a campaign strategy, we need to think for a minute about what Christian nationalism is and what it isn't. It is not the whole of Christianity, and it's not a single religion. It's both an ideology, a set of ideas, and it's also a political movement, an organized quest for power. So in the matter of ideology, this idea that America was founded as a white Christian nation, or the way that different politicians sometimes try to signal it, that it's just simply founded as a so-called Christian nation, many politicians have tried to ally themselves with this ideology, to promote it, to associate themselves with it. I'm going to just give one example. Let's talk about Ron DeSantis, who handily won his election. He doesn't lose the opportunity to identify himself with this ideology. A day before the election, his campaign released an ad saying, on the 8th day, God, chose Ron DeSantis as a fighter, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, to save America. I don't know if all of you have seen it. If you haven't, Google this ad. It really has to be seen to be believed. But what he was doing in this instance is really associating himself with the ideology of Christian nationalism, spreading the ideology, and sort of using that sort of sanctimony as a way to hold himself up as a very particular kind of candidate and appeal to the rank and file, who sort of, for whom that message is favorable. But let's look at the infrastructure of the movement. Let's look at how it functions as a political movement, as an organized quest for power. The movement consists, that ideology is really the most effective tool for a political machine that turns that deep story of America's supposedly conservative Christian founding into political power. And that movement consists of, it has a deep organizational infrastructure that we can group into categories. There are right-wing policy groups, legal advocacy groups, networking organizations, legislative initiatives, and these other features. And much of that infrastructure serves as a means of turning out the vote. The movement also operates through religious infrastructure. There are organizations like Watchmen on the Wall, Faith Wins, or in Florida in particular, there's one called Ministros Hispanos del Sur de la Florida, which is like a largely Hispanic and Latino network that has worked with Ralph Reed's Faith and Freedom Coalition and serves to target Latino voters of faith and conservative-leaning congregations. The movement leaders know very well that if you can get the pastors, you can get some subset of their congregations. So we have to look at how Ron DeSantis has worked through this particular infrastructure. I'll just give you a few examples. In 2021, he spoke to the Council for National Policy, delivered a speech to them. That's an organization that brings together movement organization leaders with some of their deep-pocketed funders and gets a lot of the movement leaders on the same page, lots of leaders of the different organizations. He has worked through the religious infrastructure of the movement. For instance, he worked in 2018, he went to the Nación de Fe church in Kissimmee, Florida, where the pastors and some congregants prayed over him. He returned in 2022 to sign a bill restricting abortion. He has spoken at Ralph, I don't know if you guys know who Ralph Reed is. He's one of the movement's most seasoned strategists. He heads an organization called the Faith and Freedom Coalition, and every year they have a conference, an annual conference called the Road to Majority Conference, bringing together movement leaders, key strategists, and activists. And he spoke at the 2021 Road to Majority Conference, and he cited a passage from Ephesians that we're hearing more and more. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit because I can't remember the exact phrasing. He said, put on the whole armor of God, take a stand against the left's schemes. Now, the word, the left, in the original passage, it's supposed to be the devil's schemes, and he substituted the left. And that's a kind of signaling to this movement and its strategists and activists that he is going to do what they want, and it's also sort of conforming to the increasing militarization of the rhetoric, the demonization of people with political differences, and So he has also collaborated with Christian nationalists and Republican leaders on gerrymandering in the state of Florida that have given Republicans a disproportionate advantage in those districts. So he's worked through movement infrastructure in a number of ways, but in many ways he's responding to what they want. I attended I'm going to be very quick and then I'm going to stop. Road to Majority Conference 2022, earlier this year, 2022, and one of the leaders of Students for Life of America, which she collaborates with a lot of other organizations, she was kind of threatening, she was talking about how a lot of these politicians who are supposedly pro-life, but don't really endorse the most extreme measures. She said, well, when they don't do that, we're going to primary them. She talked about the resources that they'll bring to bear on mounting primary challenges to Republican politicians who are not sufficiently far right. And she specifically referenced Florida, and I can't recall if she referenced DeSantis by name, but it was very clear she was referring to him. Soon enough, within the next 10 days or so, he was doing what they wanted. So that's some of the ways that the infrastructure, as well as the ideology, are being used in these ways.
I think that's a very interesting point. I think there is a case to be made that DeSantis has sort of stepped the white Christian nationalism up. I think, so you referenced one of his speeches. In his victory speech, he gave a sort of bizarre version of the Churchill quote, "We will fight them on the beaches," but he said, "We will fight the wokeness in the classrooms and in the universities." And so I think that's another example of exactly the point that you made. And Brad, let's stay with the midterms. What would you say are examples from the midterms that show how effective white Christian nationalism really is for motivating voters one way or the other?
So, as I said, no. As I said earlier tonight, I've said repeatedly over the last couple of weeks, the midterms posed a threat to American democracy, and then over the last week or so, we've kind of come to grips with the fact that the results were not as perhaps bad as we thought. And so people have asked me, how should we feel? And I think feelings are a really good metric. And my first reaction has been relief. I think it's okay to take a deep breath. I think it's okay to recognize that when it came to election deniers who were running in statewide races to be Secretary of State or governor, there was losses across the board, especially in swing states. So I think there's a sense of we've bought ourselves some time as we move forward. I also think, though, it'd be easy to say, well, let's look around the country. Kari Lake didn't win, and we're going to a runoff in Georgia. And, Doug Mastriano's not there. And Lauren Boebert won by 500 votes. We're on the right track. We're clear. This is good. A couple more days, finish the antibiotics, and we'll be out of here, right? But think about those races. Think about Kari Lake losing by less than 1% of the vote. Think about Kari Lake as a news reporter who comes out of nowhere. As a media savant, dons all of the language that Robert talked about, draws on the history that Sarah talked about, and then uses the infrastructure that Catherine talked about. And all of a sudden, this person who was never a politician has a lightning in the bottle kind of campaign, and is nearly the governor of Arizona, maybe the most key swing state in the country. So am I happy she lost? Yeah, I am. But was that an 8-point loss? Was that a 7-point loss? Was that a resounding loss? Not really. When I think about Lauren Boebert, she won. Marjorie Taylor Greene won, and Ron DeSantis won handily. So there are mixed results. And I think there are ways that we can point to the fact that drawing attention to Christian nationalism and election denial and the big lie have been hurtful in some places over the country writ large. But when I come back to feeling, I think that I want myself at least to be in a place where I feel a sense of relief, knowing that I have to get back up in the morning, ready to go again. Because the rhetoric was not a complete failure. This was not abysmal collapse because one dawned, the big lie plus the white Christian nationalist rhetoric, it was mixed results with razor-thin margins. Once again, Georgia going to the runoff, right? So, we can take sort of hope in that. Democrats have the majority. We're good, no matter what happens December 6th. Or we can say, how did a candidate as flawed as Herschel Walker running against someone like Raphael Warnock end up in a runoff? Well, it's because everything that my colleagues on the stage have already discussed remains an incredibly potent force in American politics, in my view.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent point, especially given the sort of time trajectory in which the religious right thinks. I think everybody on this stage has come across multiple points in texts and articles in their work where it becomes clear the religious right does not think in election cycles, but they think in decades, in centuries, and the most ambitious even in thousands of years. So they're patient, and they have shown in the past that they are capable of being very pragmatic about defeats and learning lessons from these defeats. I would now like to open up this panel. So these are questions for all of you. So whoever feels like they want to respond, go right ahead. I'd like to come back to the sort of theological side of white Christian nationalism. Diana Butler-Bass recently described white Christian nationalism as having three theological faces, all rooted in different Christian traditions, but sharing a commitment to theocracy: neo-Calvinist, charismatic, and trad Roman Catholics. So would you say, is it important to understand the theological differences within white Christian nationalism, especially because it seems that they all sort of disappear under the shared goal of theocracy? And are there other Christian theological traditions apart, beyond from these three that I've mentioned, that you think we should focus on?
All right, I'll take a swing at it. So I think I want to go back to this point of how old this problem is, right? So it predates even the Protestant Catholic split, right? So it's pre-Reformation. So that means that this comes through both Catholic and Protestant circles, right? Organically, like it's in the DNA. And so what I think we're seeing is, like in those very helpful categories that Diana Butler-Bass is ways in which these theological traditions actually are adapting in their own vernacular this much older problem, right? So the Reform movement kind of picks up elements of Calvinism and talks about it in that way. The Catholic movement picks up old colonial and Christendom models and talks about it that way. But it's still, I think, a part of this stream that is coming through and kind of, moving in different ways. But it has its own vernacular. But I think that's a way in which it's powerful, right? Because it does manage to kind of get itself in, and all these traditions have some way of talking about things like dominion, ownership, chosenness, promised land, like all of these kinds of tropes, right, are part of the mix. But I think they have taken root in different soils, right? But I think, again, the DNA, I think, kind of goes all the way back.
Well, I want to add to that. In the present moment, this is really not about a dispute over theology. The movement draws in representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant traditions. It even draws support from people who do not identify as Christian at all. I'm thinking specifically of Bar Said, who is a Jewish elderly billionaire from Chicago, who just donated a $1.6 billion to found the Marble Freedom Trust and put Leonard Leo, who's the Federalist Society head, in charge of it. I think about people like Peter Thiel, who has funded some of the think tanks. I think a lot of the funders, frankly, are more interested in far-right economic component of the movement. The movement is, they're much less interested in the culture wars than they are interested in pursuing a far-right economic agenda, That includes low taxes or no taxes for the super rich, minimal regulation of business, minimal regulation for the environment, minimal rights for the workforce. You even see a lot of leaders, like these very political preachers, like Ralph Drollinger and people like David Barton, who's a key myth maker of the Christian nationalist movement, talking about biblical economics and finding theological justification, this sort of hard right economics that are intensifying economic inequality and actually making it so much harder for so many American families to succeed. This is a movement that, when they're talking to the rank and file, they're saying it's all about defense of the American family, but they're driving support for these politicians who are promoting these hard right economic policies that are leading to a further intensification of economic inequality in our country. So, this is not just about the culture wars. Sometimes I think of some of the you look at the new culture wars that they're crafting, like this sort of fake CRT panic in the public schools. And, I get email every day from some right-wing, organizations talking about the threat that, of trans sports, et cetera. It's like, I think of like the red, the cat toy that's like a little, the little red laser. Get all the people chasing after this over here so they don't see the bigger picture, because this is about a broad economic policy, social policy, even foreign policy. And I think a lot of the theological disputes have been papered over in favor of a kind of a common language, a common style. I think Christian nationalist movement, there's a kind of style of politics, a kind of authoritarian, hard hand politics. There's almost a performative cruelty to a lot of it, and a common political vision.
Well, and your point about it being an economic movement makes me think about the prosperity gospel, right? And how this is sort of, right, is all caught up in this, right? So there are so many, that's what I'm so fascinated by as a religious studies scholar, right? How none of this matters, right? It's like, hey, we've found the great ecumenicalism, right? And so, but yeah, what I see in terms of what brings them together is sort of a shared commitment to a particular social order, right? And this is, I think, getting back to this question about innocence, and which I think we can think about in terms of the narratives we tell about the United States, right? I think this is, one of the big places we are at right now. What is the United States? What are the and there's big conflicts about our national identity and very different narratives. And this is, I don't think there's ever been a time when there has not been that conflict. But out of that, we have this narrative from white Christian nationalism that is steeped in myths of national innocence. And this idea that, the founding of the United States was a God-anointed beginning. And then within that, you establish a certain social order with a particular type of family that's constructed in a particular way, and rules around that. And of course, we have seen that growing, particularly, the family value stuff starting in the 1970s with Dobson and all of that. And so to see then, how the family becomes this this core piece, right? And that's something that all of these groups have in common, is a shared theology of the family. And of course, with that, a shared understanding of gender roles, of sexuality, so on and so forth. And this is, again, where we get to another place regarding innocence. And my work for the last couple years has been looking at the role of white womanhood within white Christian nationalism, and therefore how rhetorics around purity culture are used. The argument I make in my book is that purity culture was first and foremost not about helping horny adolescents, right, get through adolescence to marriage, but it was first and foremost about evangelicals gaining political power. And so if we understand that, like, then everything else makes sense. And now that we are hearing, you know, after these elections, it's been interesting to hear sort of pundits on the right talking about the single women living in the cities and who vote Democrat because they want to have their abortions, right? And so, right, we've been hearing this, right, for the last 2 weeks, and that is, and I was like, yep, that's purity culture. And then I also realized it's also the great replacement theory, right? Because if white women aren't willing to have babies, right? If they want to, you know, we want to have careers and, you know, not have partners, and then, yeah, we're not doing that. And this is also rhetoric, right? There was, I think, a white woman who, you know, kind of got Twitter famous for saying, like, white people need to have more white babies. And she was within a religious community. And so that is this sense that, and I've seen this for like white women in these communities, like this is their identity, right? Because in these conservative communities, women achieve, women get authority through motherhood, okay? And so one of the things I finally figured out, and I was someone who grew up, the age of 14, I was protesting abortion in Washington, DC. Like, my Christian high school took a field trip every year. And so I've been on a long journey with all of this stuff. But what I finally came to understand, and it wasn't until Roe v. Wade was overturned that things really clicked into place, was that the women who are fighting so hard to maintain, you know, traditional gender roles, even willing to accept, you know, a submissive position. We have all these trad cultures that have emerged within Roman Catholicism and also within Orthodoxy. And what I realized is that for them, their sense of authority, their sense of self is in motherhood. And if the nation they live in is saying that women have the right to not be mothers, and including being able to terminate a pregnancy, that completely undercuts their ability to achieve selfhood, to achieve authority within their communities, okay? So I've been sitting with that and thinking about that, you know, as sort of the secular feminist scholar, you know, trying to sort of hold that and sort of see that they are trying to do similar things that all of us are doing and trying to achieve selfhood, and have, you know, this sense of authority, but they have a particular set of rules around that. And it's a very narrow definition. And wrapped up in that, and that functions in those communities because of the way we've connected white womanhood with sexual innocence and with racial innocence. And I will stop there, but I will save the next chapter for later.
I'd quite like to dig into that a little bit more. So as a trained historian and somebody who's written about fascism a lot, what stood out to me kind of from the beginning is how many of the boxes on the sort of generic fascism list white Christian nationalism ticks. And one of those sort of characteristics that's inherent to fascist movements is the sort of sexual anxiety, which is connected to very specific forms of militant masculinity that then is presented to be under threat from outgroups who get villainized. And it's connected to pronatalism, which is where we have which then has a racial component, which is where we have the more white babies, which is why we get all of that talk about demographic winters looming. And I wondered if, I'm sure many of you have seen the trailer of one of the so-called documentaries by Tucker Carlson. We all know what I'm talking about, right? We're talking about the testicle thing. But I was wondering, have you seen this sort of sexual anxiety, racialized sexual anxiety, in the sort of run-up to the midterms? How have you seen this sort of militant masculinity in the form of white Christian nationalism? How have you seen this in the run-up to the midterms?
So, one of the things I talk about in my forthcoming book, and some of you have heard me talk about before, but I'll just say again, is that Christian nationalism is the original purity culture. So if you think about purity culture, as Sarah just said, as trying to tell young teenagers that if you order your sex life the right way, you'll please God, you'll have a good marriage, you won't ruin yourself, you won't get STDs, STIs, etc. And also, and let's not forget, if we listen closely to James Dobson and many others, you'll save our nation. Right? James Dobson says, children and teenagers are the foot soldiers of the Second Civil War. Okay? So if you think about that project in light of what Robert and Catherine and Sarah have said tonight, what you're trying to do is order and regulate sex and family in a way that you can make sure that you continue to create the nation you want, which is purified according to race and sexuality and ethnicity and language and religion. And so if you can, onto the canvas of teenage flesh, thrust all of the anxieties about the country being impure, invaded, having contagion come into it by way of too many immigrants, too many non-Christians, too many non-English speakers, then all of the things about interracial marriage that we're seeing pop up on Twitter from various Reformed theologians, all of the fears about white womanhood that Sarah's talked about come into clear view. And so the kinds of masculinity that we see in Ammon Bundy, who got a lot of votes, right, for governor, or for through Ron DeSantis, through Donald Trump, of course, and so on, to me is the idea that white Christian president will be the protector and the guarantor of those families and of that nation extended. And I'll just say one more thing, and this is something that I've said a lot on the podcast and in my writing, but if you read Leslie Doral Smith, if you read Kristen Kobes Dumais, what you realize is that great American white Christian protector, the overwhelmingly dominant, brusque, brutal man supposed to make sure that all of our anxieties are allayed by protecting our borders and boundaries, whether they be bodily or whether they be geographical, might have to be impure. He might have to be impure. He might have to be the one who is given to barbarous violence, because that's the only way we're going to maintain these bodies and these families and this nation. And so it's not that that's a sign that they're not good at the job. It's the very sign that they are the man we want for the job. And that's why Christian nationalism is the original purity culture. If you codify violence into the very beginnings of the American founding or the colonies and so on as a racial religious violence, well, then it only continues in what I think we see today.
So maybe as a sort of last question before we open this up to questions from the audience, let's stay with the violence aspect of this. So I think we've all noticed that in the run-up to the midterms, political violence was a very prominent part of many Republican campaigns, either while being openly endorsed, being implicit in threatening ads, and this is also a racialized violence. It's a violence that I think has shocked many people whose job is not to deal with all of this stuff from day to day. And so I was wondering if you could sort of shed a bit of light on that. How is this violence being presented as sanctified? And can you give us an example, maybe from the midterms, maybe from earlier, from sort of the last decade or so, of how political violence is being presented as not only legitimate but necessary?
I'd love to speak to that. At some of the right-wing conferences, you hear an increasing use of demonization. Democrats are democratic organizations are described as demonic organizations, satanic, atheistic at the same time, both atheistic and also satanic, and worthy of elimination. Basically, you hear a kind of upticking in the rhetoric of violence. We've heard this not just in metaphorical ways, but in very concrete ways. Before we came out on stage, Sarah and I were chatting, I hope it's okay if I relate this, about how she, in a town area where she has family, you see the increasing use of these black flags, which means that the flags are being put out there, meaning that people are willing to take up arms in defense of their idea of what this nation is. I do want to point out that rhetoric of violence and Christian nationalism itself, even though, let's be clear, it's overwhelmingly white people who support it, it does appeal to a non-trivial number of people of color. Anthea Butler, a professor at University of Pennsylvania, who's actually receiving a wonderful award tomorrow night, has spoken about how there's a kind of promise of whiteness that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be white to participate in the sort of privilege of whiteness. But we've seen this for years. The movement leaders have reached out to a number of people of color where they feel like they can get them through congregations, often through Pentecostal and neo-charismatic congregations. Pentecostalism, as you all probably know, is an incredibly diverse religious movement, but it does score overall very high on measures of Christian nationalism. And there's a kind of element of the supernatural where there's a kind of normalization of the talk about demons and the idea that congregants are engaged in spiritual battle, but then there's also the promise of rewards, not just in the ever after, but also the here and now. So that sort of battle of demons starts to take on very concrete, a kind of concrete connotations. And you hear this language of battle being normalized across many denominations. I've heard it in more Catholic, conservative Catholic settings. I've heard it uttered by people who are, representatives of various types of Protestant denominations. So you're just hearing an uptick in this rhetoric of violence and demonization of the political other. And frankly, I think it's very dangerous.
Yeah, I'll just jump into a couple. I'll go back to this point I made earlier about what we see in the data. Like, if you ask in the country whether people believe that true American patriots need to resort to violence in order to save the country, it's only about 15% of Americans who say that, but it's 3 in 10 Republicans. And it number jumps to 43% among people who believe this basic tenet of white Christian nationalism, that God intended America to be a kind of promised land for European Christians. 43% of people who believe that say they can imagine, right, that violence is justified. And I feel like I've turned in the historian tonight, but it's worth just noting, right, that again, you go back to what do we do with Native Americans, right? We kill, displace in the name of God, right? It was manifest destiny. I mean, these are theological concepts that go deep, deep in the kind of historical psyche of the U.S. So they're able to be, tapped in that way. And I was just thinking of one other thing that Ron DeSantis, he's also rolled out the Onward Christian Soldiers motif, right, at his rallies, which is a Christian hymn that I grew up singing. But and then January 6th, I do think it's worth noting that if you really watch the videos, what you see, right, are anti-Semitic things. You see the Confederate flag, white supremacist symbol there, and you see the Christian flag. I think that was the thing I was the most stunned to see, frankly. Not just crosses, but the Christian flag, which is the thing that many of you may have seen, like me, behind the pulpit, right, in the sanctuary. Was this white, it's a white flag with a white field. It has a blue canton with a red Latin cross in the corner. And that flag marched into the breach congressional chamber right after the Confederate flag. on January 6th, right? So we got crosses, we've got Bibles, we've got shofars blown not by Jews, but by Christians. All of this imagery, we had it like right on display in front of us. And I think at a moment of insurrection and violence in the country. So, I think it is something to be concerned about, right? That this many Americans will tell us in a public opinion survey that they think under these circumstances violence may be justified. These little grassroots movements that we see popping up, it's certainly something to be diligent about. Now, the last thing I'll say is that when we think about democracy, right, democracy depends on us having political opponents, right, with whom we disagree, with whom we fight politically. But once, the bill has passed or the election has lost, the idea of a democracy is that we have to live with those people, right? They're our fellow citizens that we have to live with. And one of the things that this rhetoric of substituting the wiles of the devil for the left, right, does is it breaks down those basic bonds of civic friendship, right? And it turns it into this binary good versus evil battle. And then we don't have political opponents. We have the enemies of God, right, that we have to defeat. And that is just absolutely death to a pluralistic democracy.
And with this cheerful note, I would like to see if we have any questions from the audience. And I think, from the audience, both online and in person. And we have 20 minutes in total for this. So just as an estimate, let's maybe go to Dan in the audience, who I believe
So I will make my way around, so
has the
bear
first
with me
audience
as
question
as
for
I do
us.
that.
Okay, I'm going to try to state this quickly as a question. I see, so first of all, Catherine, I love your book. And so this is going to mostly be directed toward you, but others may have thoughts as well. There's so much great, important information in it. And I think I might either disagree with or need clarification on sort of part of your thesis. And so it has to do with this. It feels like a lot of the argument currently that comes from the progressive left, whatever you want to call yourself in that camp, is this nation was not founded as a Christian nation, and that's the pushback that we hear amongst politicians and all kinds of folks who are trying to combat this white Christian nationalism. I appreciate putting the term white in front of that, by the way. But what I also agree with is what we're hearing in the conversation tonight is that actually, from the very beginnings of this nation, from the time that settler colonialism and empire and all of that came to these shores, there has been this certain brand, at least, of Christianity and pushing for theocracy and manifest destiny being a big, part of all of that, and doctrine of discovery. And so it seems to me that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but that feels like that was like part of the argument of your book too, was to sort of make this separation that no, this was not founded to be a Christian nation. It was founded to have this separation of church and state. And then you come in with, all this wonderful information about here's how this has worked in more recent decades, right? This is the iteration of it now, and that's what's gotten us to where we are today, which everybody should read. But I'm just wondering, to me, it feels like those who are on the left in whatever form, whether they identify as Christian or not, need to be talking about this part of the conversation that has been coming up already tonight, which is that, and this is what Indigenous and Native American scholars, many have been saying for years and years and years, right? Like, this has been here from day one. It maybe looks a little different currently, but it's always been there in the foundations and in literally the blood of this country. So I'm just wondering if you could, kind of clarify, and if others want to jump in on that too, that'd be great.
Thanks for that question. That's really great. The myth of America's Christian founding, as told by Christian nationalist pseudo-historians like David Barton is so flawed that it could be, I just don't know where to begin. If you're just looking at the words of our founders, many of them were, they were a complicated and diverse bunch, but many of them were deists, which was considered a heresy in their time, and they, were not intending to found America, for to benefit a pope or for a religious purpose. The ideals of America have never been perfectly applied, but there are still ideals worth fighting for. The ideals of equality, the ideals of equal rights, pluralism. These are not just, we're not just dealing with what happened at the time of America's founding, but we're also dealing with what America has become over centuries and through waves of immigration. But the narrative of America's allegedly conservative Christian founding, as told by the leaders of the Christian right, is just plain out wrong. I mean, there have been many books written about this. I think about David Barton's book, The Jefferson Lies, in which he tries to reframe Thomas Jefferson as an allegedly super conservative Christian. It was so flawed that his own publisher, which is a Christian publisher, Thomas Nelson Publishing, withdrew it because they said it lacked matters of fact. David Barton at that point was known for having come up with quotes that the founders allegedly said, for which there was absolutely no evidence. And yet that myth has been too valuable to the movement to discard simply because it's not true. So I do think that today it's worth talking about the ideals of America's founding, even though they have been imperfectly applied over time. The ideals are beautiful and worth fighting for. And I think a lot of people are trying to contend with America's actual history, the genocide of Native American genocide, the fact that we have had centuries of slavery, inequality, and the like. But that's what I was addressing, pushing back on, in that particular section of my book, pushing back on the sort of tissue of fantasy that folks like David Barton are promoting.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, you're good.
Figured it out. I have a PhD. So I'm going to be 30 seconds. The myth that you just referenced is accepted as benign at the Thanksgiving table and at Christmas dinner. We're a Christian nation, and it's passed around not in militias, not in black robe regiments, but from Aunt Betsy to Uncle John, every night at a dinner table. And I think what your question really points out is that we cannot see that as benign. It is not. It is hurtful, and it relies on a history that is full of attempted genocide, as Robert's talked about, and is full of contemporary violence, as all of us have talked about. So I just think accepting that as like a tried and true Americana mantra is something that we have to call out.
Great. Am I on? Kind of synthesizing a few questions on here, which boil down to not just how do we talk to Uncle Ron about this, but how do we talk to people that we love about this, or people who are harming us because of our own marginalized identities, LGBTQ, people of color, et cetera, et cetera. How do we talk to people that we care about that are trapped in this?
So I'll take this one. One of the things I had to shift in the last book I wrote was I had to learn how to, as a scholar, they train you out of using the first person, right? I, right? You don't write sentences that begin with I or we. And I really had to work myself out of that if I was going to honestly attack this problem and write a book to my fellow white Christians. right? I was got to like write, I and we and implicate myself in the story. And I think that that was part of what I think is a way of telling my own, like I told my own family story in White Too Long, right? How we come to Georgia in the early 1800s, and we receive free land, right? In the 1820s, where does that come from? Right, it comes from the Trail of Tears, right? As Native Americans are pushed off the land, they're carving it up into 200-acre squares and handing it out in land lotteries for people. So we came down from Virginia and got our free plots of land in 1815. So like learning to tell that story, right? So where do my family come from? Pulling up the estate settlement of my fifth great uncle, who's my fifth great grandfather was named for, like my kind of a namesake in our family, and whose Bible I have in my family's possession that was also published in 1815. So we're really proud of that Bible, right, in our Christian ancestors, but they were also enslavers, right? And so how do we tell that story? And so I think part of it for me, at least as someone who's in that space, was trying to just tell my story in a way that isn't a finger wagging from the outside pointing at somebody else, but is like asking the question, so what do I do with that heritage?
So I teach courses in which our first course goal is how to have difficult conversations on controversial topics. And I teach a course on religion, race, and discrimination in the US. So supposedly I can answer this question. The first thing I say to students is, you don't have to have this conversation if you can't. So that's my first piece of advice, right? There's no obligation for you to make people understand, especially if it's putting you in a position of harm, right? So, and figuring out how to be in a heated moment, especially with with family, with people who are closest to you, who you're always going to be in a relationship with. It's a lot about, what I have learned is it's a lot about knowing yourself, right? It's not about, and I know, right, God bless Uncle Ron, but it's not, you're going to get mad at me. It's not about proving Uncle Ron wrong. It's about being in his presence and being able to be yourself and not back down from being yourself. And that's all you need to do, right? Because there's always going to be someone who's smarter, who can make a better argument, who's funnier, right? Who has a better pot shot. But no one can deny yourself. No one can deny you. So when I think about going into these kinds of conversations, I think about, like, what is the intention in going in? What is your exit strategy? And how do you monitor your nervous system in the moment, right? So that's and I think this every time they talk about Uncle Ron, I'm just like, no, that's not how you do it. Anyway, but yeah, so I've taught something called intergroup dialogue for a few years now, and this is what we teach students to do, to have these difficult conversations. And then they all just sit there and stare at each other. So it's hard work, but most of the work is just, where are you when you are going into this conversation, right? Regardless of the topic. And so that's what I would offer.
It wouldn't be a straight white American Jesus thing if Uncle Ron wasn't here, at least in spirit, right? So thank you for that. Another audience question. Yeah, I saw one here.
So this is going to dovetail off of that. So now we talked about, we're all in here about understanding, right? And we're talking about how to help others understand as well. That's super valuable, right? You can't solve the problem, you don't understand it. So I'm going to ask your opinions. I have my own. Like, what's your call to action? Like, how do we solve the problem? How do we act positively to turn the tide, advance things?
So I'll say on two levels we can think about it. I think on an interpersonal level, I actually agree with you, Sarah. So I think when we're with Uncle, on podcasts we talk about Uncle Ron. What I really want is for folks to know that they're not subject to Uncle Ron's bad argument and incoherency. Okay, that you know there's an answer, and whether or not you need to prove Uncle Ron wrong actually never really helps all that often. But I think what I heard Sarah saying, and I'm happy for Sarah to tell me this is not right, but if we think about what Robert said about demonization, the left is the devil, the left smells like sulfur, the left has serpent DNA, and you're with your loved one, your friend, your sibling, and you're human through and through, and you're able to be a human being, and to use the proximity of saying, is that what you see when you see me? Like, I'm here with you. We're breaking bread. We're sharing a space. We're mourning a loved one. We're trying to figure out a stage of life. We're talking through a hard issue. We're moving mom into care. Do you think I smell like a demon? Do you when you see me, do you see Satan? Or do you see someone who cares about you and loves you and who disagrees with you? Can I be your democratic neighbor and loved one rather than a demonic spirit? On an interpersonal level, I think that's a big thing. Arguments and facts and histories, Twitter's about to collapse, but before a lot of us were on Twitter, we were on Facebook arguing with Uncle Ron, right? At least I was, right? Okay. And every time I did it, my wife, who's watching right now, would say, "What are you doing? It doesn't help. That helps nothing. You didn't do any good. And you spent 3 hours, and your blood pressure's through the roof, and it's all, the night's ruined. So thanks a lot." I think on a civic level, and Michael, I know that you and I have talked about this. On a civic level, there's got to be a recognition that just as on the right, this is not a fight that ends 2 years from now. It's not a fight that ends 5 years from now. This is a story that goes beyond us. But if we want to participate in a creedal democracy based on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if we believe in equality and freedom for everyone, then that's a story that we've tapped into, as Catherine just said, going back to our founding, and it's worth fighting for, and it's one we have to forecast going forward. It's not one that stops when we turn the tide in 2024, and then we can all go back to brunch. It doesn't work that way. And that means PTA meetings, that means state legislatures, that means county seats, that means mayoral runs, that means all of those building blocks of democracy. Not just who's in the White House, not just who's at the top of the ticket in your state. It has to be a recognition that all of that founding, all of that inheritance, and all of that anticipation of what can be of an America that we love and we find liberating for all, that's one that's built from the ground up, and every ligament and every tissue and every organ going forward all the way up to the executive. And if we don't see it that way, then I think the historians and the journalists in this room will tell you we've already seeded it, because on every granular level across this country, that's where the other side is invested billions of dollars.
There's a lot of really good questions on here, but we don't have time for all of them. I'm going to tackle this one here. Immediately following the midterms, we haven't seen the level of organized political violence that we saw after the 2020 election, yet the rhetoric of demonization, stolen elections, and conspiracy theories seems as strong as ever. What do you think accounts for this difference, and is there a real risk of complacency that this fever has broken?
Well, I think the arrests of hundreds of people has had a dampening factor, right? Our justice, I was glad to see that our justice system has been doing what it's supposed to do. I'm not convinced that it always does. So, but I think in this case, I think we can say, yep, they've systematically gone after people who participated in January 6th. And it's interesting because you haven't seen a lot of it in the news, but I do think it has had a dampening effect. So I'll just stop there and someone can pick up on the second part of that question.
I'll just say very quickly, I think a question that will plague those of us who study and think about these things a lot is, where does Christian nationalism and violence stand without the former president either on the ticket or able to be on a platform like Twitter, sort of blasting things out? I had someone ask me at an event this week, can you separate Trumpism from Christian nationalism? And my response was, we'll see. We'll see. The next couple of years here will really sort of bear out that question, whether we talk about Ron DeSantis or Glenn Youngkin or any number of other candidates, but also just, can you separate Trumpist violence and MAGA violence from Trump himself? And that, I think, is also an open question.
I want to add something to that, actually. I think the sort of promotion of election denial is a kind of violence against the truth. And I'm starting to see some election denialism among Christian nationalist leaders now, like Charlie Kirk, who heads Turning Point USA. He's a very powerful sort of youth leader. He has started promoting election denial. Carrie Lake, I believe, has refused to concede. These are just two examples, but I'm starting to see more and more. So I think that kind of separating the people, separating the rank and file from the truth and from the facts, it's its own kind of violence, but it also lays the groundwork for potential violence in the future. January 6th would not have happened if Christian nationalist networks and leaders had not bought into Trump's lies and in fact promoted Trump's lies through their networks.
Just one quick addition. You can see it in the data. There's actually high correlations between election denial and Christian nationalism in the data. Like, they're highly, highly positively correlated.
So unfortunately, we have to stop here, but we have got another amazing panel lined up for all of you with great guests after a short intermission. So you can, get up, stretch your legs, have a chat, a therapeutic chat maybe. And we will see you again in 10 minutes back here.
All right. Most of us are used to teaching college students, and when you give them a 10-minute break, that usually means a 27-minute break. So we are loving this. That's amazing. I just said break's over, and you all sat down, which is kind of miraculous. So I'm going to just say we have an amazing second panel for you, and I'll just turn it over to my co-host Dan Miller to moderate and introduce the panelists.
So yeah, really, like sitting down, it's great. I always have students who run off to get lunch, and like, you had 10 minutes. I don't know how you thought you were going to do that. As you'll notice, I've said we had a couple panelists who weren't able to join us, and we've had Larisha, who very graciously joined us, and Miguel. So thank you to them. I just want to briefly introduce the panelists, and then we're going to do a similar sort of discussion. Some of the questions are the same that we asked before. We'll just sort of float those around again. Some will be a little bit different. Similar format after, so if you didn't get a chance to ask a question after the first panel, we'll do our best to try to get to you after this panel. So the first person I'll introduce is Larisha Hawkins. Assistant professor of politics and religious studies at University of Virginia, featured in the documentary Same God, so feel free to Google that, take a look. I guess I'll go this way. Philip Gorski is professor of sociology and chair at the Department of Sociology at Yale University. He's the author of many books, including, with Sam Perry, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. Excuse me. Samuel Perry is associate professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma and author, again, of multiple books, with Andrew Whitehead, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, a book that was hugely influential for me, and again with Philip, the Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. And Miguel de la Torre, we talked earlier that I cannot roll R's. I can't. I should for his name, so I apologize. He is professor of social ethics and Latinx studies here at the Isla School of Theology in Denver. Basically walked over for the event, so we're glad to have him. He is also the author of multiple books, including Decolonizing Christianity, Becoming Badass Believers, and Burying White Privilege, Resurrecting a Badass Christianity, a book that I really, really enjoyed and had the opportunity to review. Again, some of the questions will be the same, and I want to say I'm happy to sort of lead out sometimes and direct them to somebody, and then welcome others to sort of chime in as you will. Miguel, I'll start with you, and this is a question from the first panel, but people often refer kind of both, and I did in my introduction, to Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism. In your view, and again, others can jump in as well here, why does it matter? What is the role of that white? Why white Christian nationalism? This is a question that I know Brad and I get all the time from people who may not be as sympathetic with the podcast. They'll be like, we love everything you say, but you always make it about being white. So yeah, what do you think about that notion of white Christian nationalism versus just Christian nationalism? What is the role of whiteness in what we're talking about here tonight?
So I think to answer that question, maybe we should look at those three words: white, Christian, and nationalism. So white really has nothing to do with skin pigmentation. Whiteness is an ontological whiteness. That means that you could have Black white nationalists, Latino white nationalists, Asian white nationalists. It is the embracing of a white supremacy ideology, even when it goes against one's own community. My former chair of my dissertation, John Raines, always used to say, we like to dream upward but blame downward. So in the dreaming of upward, many times communities of color also dream upward, dreaming they too can become white, and then we blame downward at whoever is the latest to come. As far as Christianity, the second one, James Cone, almost 60 years ago, probably said it best. All white Christianity is satanic. And what he meant was that any Christianity that fails to take into consideration Jim and Jane Crow has nothing to do with the gospel message. Therefore, there really never was Christianity in this country. From the beginning of the slaughter of the indigenous people, to the slavery of the African people, to the invasion of Latin American countries to steal their raw materials and cheap labor. If there was any Christianity, any gospel type of Christianity, it always existed on the underside of the United States. And then that last word, nationalism. As an immigrant, as a refugee, it's an interesting word for me to look at this nation's nationalism, because I approach it from the underside of nationalism. And that's to say that when we look at this present white Christian nationalism as a conservative thing, for some of us on the underside, it's not a conservative thing, it's a conservative and a liberal thing. Liberals could be just as much engaged in white supremacy, even though they know the politically correct things to say. When Joe Biden says, referring to Donald Trump, that is not who America is, that's exactly who America is. And that America is comprised of liberals and conservatives. And frankly, I sometimes find liberals more infuriating when it comes to issues of white Christian nationalism, because at least I know where the conservatives are coming from. I can't always tell where those who are supposed to be my allies are coming from.
Thank you. Would others like to jump in, or we can move to the next topic?
I'll just say something briefly. Like Robbie Jones, we collect a lot of data, and I will just say that I think we find in just about every data set, not just the data that we've collected. I was just looking at Pew data this past week, in fact, and it is quite clear that white Americans respond to questions about Christian nationalism differently than other people of non-white racial or ethnic groups. When white Americans respond to those kinds of questions about Christian nation, Christian heritage, Christian values, and how they want to see those things institutionalized in our government, it is powerfully correlated with support for anti-democratic practices, authoritarian violence, all kinds of xenophobic attitudes, Islamophobia, all of these kinds of things. When, say, African Americans respond to the same questions, it is not associated with those things, because that kind of language, that kind of Christian nationalist language, is racialized. It is perceived through a racial lens. It is interpreted through one's own experiences and racial history. And so when we speak about white Christian nationalism, it is quite empirically, quite simply, empirically something that is different, that we can see, and it shows up on just about every survey and data set that we've collected on the issue. And so we don't just mean conceptually something different. It is actually demonstrably, empirically something that moves in different directions, depending on your own racial identity. And I will say, I completely agree the idea that this isn't just about racial identity or skin color or something like that. It is more about white ethnoculture, which is why you can have some people support that who say are people of color. Yeah.
Thank you. So Larisha, I'll throw it to you next to lead out. And Larisha was originally going to be on the first panel and stepped into this panel. And so again, sort of a repetition of a question, but I want to hear what we might think about it. And so I'll repeat it here. At the Yale Conference on White Christian Nationalism, Jeff Charlotte noted that white Christian nationalism as a fascist movement is an innocence cult. It is innocent of history. How does that help us to understand how white Christian nationalism makes use of historical analysis, this notion of innocence?
Well, I think that a lot of people have thought about this question, and so I think I'll approach it from various directions, maybe different than some analysts might. I think when we look at history from the perspective of the oppressed, thinking about a kind of pedagogy of the oppressed and a perspective of the oppressed, the ways that folks like to kind of analyze white Christian nationalist movements, kind of giving credence, yes, to religionists. And I wasn't at the conference, but so I'm not sure that I know what he means by an innocent cult and an innocence of history. I would say it's selective remembering and selective forgetting. I think erasure has become a term that's bandied about quite a bit, but I think as a concept, throwing that out is just kind of too easy now. It's a little bit like saying intersectionality, and everyone's like, yeah, got it, right? It's beyond erasure. Because it's become codified. This kind of cherry picking of what counts as history in the white Christian nationalist imagination, which in my mind is a fascist imagination. What it becomes is, over time, a continual rebuilding of the cornerstone of the edifice of white American exceptionalism, which is white Christian exceptionalism, which is white Christian nationalism. So it's pernicious, and not unlike when we study misinformation and how misinformation works in the polity. This continual, the airplane gods were against me today. So I was in airport purgatory, religious panel con, so I walked in on purity culture, but I did hear something about Jefferson and the kind of mythos. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, right? And the mythic past plays into a propaganda which is so fundamental to continuing these kinds of fascistic narratives. So I think the danger of that is it's a purposeful denial, a purposeful exclusion that then becomes a political project. It becomes, in this case, with white Christian nationalism, when you have these people ensconced in power,
Got it?
People ensconced in power in large numbers. Does that help? It's the devil. Big deal. Okay. But yeah. So I think I make my point, right? Like that it's not institutionalized. So that mythic past it's not an innocent cult. It's not an innocent history. And so there can be no innocent tellings of history. And I don't know if you talked about this in the previous panel since I was late, but in Virginia, we have this critical race theory, like every other place, in conversation in the latest iteration yesterday, 5-hour-long board meeting in the state of Virginia for the State Board of Education. And the goal, like one of the goals is to realign history with the standards of learning in the state, the SOLs, which could stand for something else, but anyway, you know what I mean? But one of the first things that is apparent is that Native Americans are being called the first immigrants to the country. Is that an innocent history? That's what, yes, so, again.
Thank you. One of the things that stands out to me, right, is we talk about this in the podcast a lot, the saying the quiet parts out loud, and that that doesn't even have the pretense of being innocent anymore, right? It's like actively going and saying we aren't going to teach these things. We're going to remove these things from the curriculum and so forth. So thank you. I'm flanked by co-authors here, and so this is a question sort of for Sam and for Philip. And either one of you can lead out or however you want to respond to this. As you say in the flag and the cross, I think white Christian nationalism isn't new to the U.S. and we heard this in the first panel, right? That we can trace this history all the way back. Miguel makes this point. One of the things that's of interest to me is, because I agree with all of that, I think all of that is correct. Why does it feel new to so many Americans, right? Why does it feel to many that this is something that somehow spring up in the last 5, 6, 7 years? What has changed over the past decade or whatever it is that would create that sense of novelty if this is a pernicious phenomenon that goes all the way back to the founding?
Sure. So I guess the first question in a way is, why was it invisible to so many folks? And this includes people who are, and broadly speaking, within this white Christian nationalist subculture, as well as people who are outside of it. I think in the first case, it's just because the water folks swim in the air that they breathe, that permeates the subculture so much. It's there in popular media, it's there in textbooks that people use to teach their kids. It's there in sermons that are preached on Sunday and conversations afterward. And I think to a lot of secular progressives who are outside of this subculture and rarely, if ever, interact with folks like that, it was invisible just because it seemed like something that they imagined was somehow in our past, if they were aware of it at all. So why suddenly does it seem to be everywhere? White Christian nationalism is a very deep current within American history, but it's a current that ebbs and flows. And as I sort of look back over its long history, there are really 4 things that seem to bring it to sort of high tide. One is mass immigration. One is economic crises. Another is foreign wars. And last but not least, movements to Black empowerment. Well, I don't think I need to tell folks that if you just look back over the last decade or so, that we've ticked every single one of those boxes. And to this, I would simply add perhaps a 5th factor, which is that the sense of demographic threat that comes from projections of a majority-minority country by pick your year, 2045, 2050. I mean, I personally regard this characterization as somewhat misleading. For example, it does not take into account the increasing numbers of mixed-race people in the United States. And I think by 2040, 2050, those numbers are only going to have gone. But as a source of demographic panic, that feeds into, these concerns about, white genocide and the cult of white motherhood that Sarah was talking about. That I think is a fifth factor that, is even accelerating this movement more.
Thank you. Sam, what would you add or want to jump into?
I would just say, spot on. I think the idea that Christian nationalism ebbs and flows over time and is largely a response to threat. And you can actually see this with experimental data. Two scholars recently, I think actually working with the team, Mara Al-Khair and Mikey Pasek, who are experimental psychologists, they did this experiment where they exposed a group of Christians, Christian participants, to various kinds of narratives about the future of religion in the United States. In one group, they told about Christianity's imminent decline, right? Like how demographically they were going to be the minority and by 2050, and they were no longer going to be the majority. And they found that telling that group about their impending demographic decline actually increased their Christian nationalism and their Trump support. They're more likely to vote for Trump and as a candidate. And in that sense, demonstrating that Christian nationalism really did respond. It intensified when people felt, when Christians in this sense felt like, oh gosh, we need to circle the cultural wagons. We need to double down on who we really are and who this nation really belongs to. And so I think you can see that not just through history, but you can actually see it in the numbers. Christian nationalism is a response to the perception that something is being taken away from me or is about to be. And so we need to rally together around some common cultural heritage.
Thank you. Other thoughts? I don't want anybody to feel like they don't get to jump in if they want to. All right, so I do have a next question, kind of, and this one I would like to just sort of open up to everybody, whoever wants to lead out, and I'm interested in what everybody thinks. Again, some overlap with the first panel, but we want to hear kind of where everybody's at with this. I've seen a lot of analyses and opinion pieces that have argued that white Christian nationalism sort of wasn't a winning brand during the midterms. It didn't work the way that they wanted it to, and so forth. Do you think that's correct? And what should we expect as we move forward toward 2024? Is it going to be more of the same? Is it going to be pulled back some? Is it all contingent right now on what happens with special counsels and presidential candidates and things like this? What do we think of that analysis that it sort of wasn't a winning brand and so it'll go away, or where I guess what is the future of this rhetoric in the next, say, 2 to 4 years?
I'll say something really quick, and I'd love to hear from my co-panelists on this. So we collected data in October 2022, just less than a month ago, and we found something interesting in these data. We asked Americans, how much they agreed with statements like, my views on religion and politics represent those of the majority of Americans, and my views on religion and politics are growing as a percentage of the population. We found that the more Americans subscribe to Christian, more white Americans subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology, the more likely they are to believe that my views represent those of the majority and my views are growing. What does that suggest? Well, one, it means they divorced from reality, right? Because that is not true. Their views do not represent those of the majority and their views are not growing. But it means that their conclusions about their strength, their political strength, their numerical strength, don't necessarily have to be tied to any kind of results or evidence or indications to the contrary. So I believe it is unlikely that white Christian nationalism, again, because it ebbs and flows, because it's come in all different manifestations and flavors over time, I believe it is unlikely, but I would love to hear.
I guess I'd just add a couple of things. So one is, it's very strange, right? I mean, Christian nationalism was not a phrase you would have heard outside of a seminar room, even just 5 or 8 years ago. And suddenly there are, best-selling manifestos for Christian nationalism on Amazon.com and people openly embracing the label. My hunch about what those responses that Sam mentioned reflect is that there is a kind of kind of a groundswell going on with some of these communities where more and more people are embracing the label. They see a lot of their leaders openly embracing the label. They see, kind of theologians and thought leaders and political activists kind of, turning it into a sort of a program, an explicit program. And so they get the sense, well, everybody's talking about this. I mean, every time I turn around, it's sort of popping up in conversations, or somebody who I respect or listen to or follow is talking about it. So it would be my hunch about what's going on, is that what you are, what this reflects, is the emergence of a bona fide Christian nationalist movement that identifies itself as such. And relatedly, and Sam has often made this point, that Christian nationalism is increasingly turning into a political strategy. Now, Doug Mastriano, for example, does not seem to have mobilized that strategy terribly subtly or successfully. But let's not forget, Carrie Lake almost won. She almost won. And Ron DeSantis, I can assure you, is no dummy. If he's field testing this stuff, as he appears to be doing, it's because he thinks it might well be a winning message, and he's going to figure out a way to package it that will seem less crazy than what Doug Mastriano was doing. Like, I don't know, fewer shofars, more, something. It'll be a little bit more suburban light Christian nationalism.
Thank you. Miguel, Arisha, yeah.
Yeah, I also would be careful not to conflate Trumpism with white Christian nationalism. Trump was a convenient Patsy, I don't know, Donnie. If we think back to Tea Party, and Sarah, I hear Sarah mentioned the cult of white motherhood. But if we think back to the Tea Party, we think back to Sarah Palin. Really, what Trump is the instantiation of what she began, almost wholesale. That was like Oklahoma, wholesale. I'm wearing my boots today. I'm not alone in the boots on the stage, but it's a serious point, because what we see in the data, and they're in the data more than I am, but we see people choosing on surveys, evangelical even, and when you look deep in the data, they don't even know what the hell that means. So people choosing evangelical as a label, as a political identity, right? And so what's occurring is also, political scientist Ashley Jardina talks about the emergence of white identity politics, which is the emergence of white group interests in policy, like whites beginning to understand, like Black Americans have voted for a long time, that according to what we call heuristics, like what happens to one member of one Black person in the United States tends to affect all of us, right? And so what we're seeing is the congealing of both the white consciousness, but also even amongst white liberals voting according to white interests. One of the examples she uses is legacy admissions. Mm-hmm. Whites, regardless of who you are, support legacy admissions. That's flat. Like if you look at the graph, it's flat. And so it's important to note that this is operative, independent of the Christian nationalist piece, this burgeoning white interest. You can talk about all identity politics all you want to, but I like to say white supremacy is the beginning of identity politics, and white Christian nationalism is predicated on a white supremacist Christian hermeneutic. So it makes sense then that that when we see folks lobbing on to religion, ironically, as a way of expressing political identity, we've got something kind of independent of Trump, this figure. It's not disconnected from, kind of this symbiosis between the Republican Party and white evangelicalism and Mormonism, et cetera, conservative religionists. But it's also separate. He just was a convenient kind of ram in the bush, if you will.
Thank you. Gil.
I find the word branding to be fascinating because if we say branding, well, maybe you're correct. Maybe this last election cycle, the brand failed. But that doesn't mean white Christian nationalism has failed. It just means how it was packaged did not work as well. But even that's problematic because after storming the Capitol, after having my people be called those with lots of problems, rapists and bringing drugs to this country, what was really expected was a repudiation of this white Christian nationalism. That did not happen. It did not happen in this last election or in the 2020 election. So if we're going to move forward, I apologize, if this nation is going to move forward on the same track, the question then becomes how do they rebrand this white Christian nationalism to be kinder and more gentler and more appealing to a larger audience that can go ahead and embrace it and still have, my best friend is still Black or Latino, and I give charity to, to soup kitchen, to those poor folks, but at the same time, maintain that same ideology. So branding is fantastic. And maybe the second thing, we've, as we've been saying, we've always had white Christian nationalism, regardless of who the president is. I mean, whoever is the president runs the empire. It doesn't matter if the empire is a person of color or a woman or trans, it doesn't matter. They're still responsible to the empire and to maintain the empire. So we find ourselves in a predicament on how to brand this, so to make that more palatable.
Thank you. I sort of tied in with this notion of branding, of political messaging, and so forth. This is an issue I bring up all the time. It's clearly my issue, but I hear from people all the time who want to draw distinctions or try to read the tea leaves about, who are the true believers in this, right? When a Ron DeSantis or, up in my neck of the woods, Bolduc in New Hampshire or somebody like that, they say the Christian nationalist things. They're obviously making that pitch to try to win over that demographic, but you get somebody like Bolduc who immediately stops as soon as he wins his primary, right? All of a sudden, he's trying to appeal to a broader audience. So this question that often comes up is the people who are doing it for political expediency versus the people who really believe it, the true believers. And I feel, I guess my personal view is that I don't know that there's a lot of value to that. I think the effects are the same, but I would like to hear from all of you what you think about that, right? Number one, can we tell? Is there some litmus test we can give to know when somebody says these things that they're just kind of repeating what they hear? It's, as you say, Phil, it becomes part of the air that they breathe, the water they swim in, what have you, versus, having really thought it out and owning it. Or those who are just using it because it might work. It might work in the next election, or it might get them some more votes, or whatever. Can we tell that difference? And does that difference really matter when we're looking at the concrete effects of Christian nationalist discourse?
I don't know if it matters so much. I mean, I don't think Donald Trump believes anything. I don't. I don't mean that to be funny. I just don't. Donald Trump, perfected that kind of culture war, us versus them, Christianity's under siege kind of rhetoric in 2016, and trotted it out again in 2020, and consistently delivered W's for the Christian right. I mean, he, promises made, promises kept in terms of appointing SCOTUS justices and going to bat for the things that they wanted to see. Does he believe it any more now than he did then? No, and I don't think then they don't care now because he's a loser, and so they're gonna pick up DeSantis, who is the winner now, and so that's So, I look at Trump and I don't think he believes any of it, but I think they rally to it because it means he will fight for us. Like, it means he is the bully, as Tony Perkins said, he is the guy who stands up and punches the bully. And that's what they want. They want a bully. They want that DeSantis, like Catherine Stewart was pointing out with that ad. They want the God made a warrior commercial from DeSantis to say this guy will fight for us, whether he really believes it or not. They just want the W.
Yes, others on this? Miguel?
I totally agree. It really doesn't matter if a politician believes in this or doesn't, or even say they want nothing to do with it. They will still support the white supremacy attitude of the nation. But what scares me are the true believers in the pew. When the churches, when ministers preach this and point to the Bible or to any other sacred text and uses that to rally the congregants to vote in a certain way, that's what scares the hell out of me. Those are the true believers. And that's where the greatest damage is done, because they're the ones that provide the oxygen for these politicians to either out of belief or opportunism or whatever to capitalize on that.
I think it matters, though. I think if you didn't get a chance to watch CNN promote Vice President Pence's book the other night, you should. They had a town hall for 2 hours with Pence, and it was essentially him reciting his new autobiography. But he's going to run for president. He kind of repudiated Trump, but this question of can you tell, are they genuine, does it matter? I think it matters because I think he's the kind of person, Robert Jeffress is the kind of person that you're talking about. They're the kind of people who have power and sway and come off to a lot of lay folks as genuine in their faith, in their belief. You might write off Trump because, he can't even pronounce, what was it, 1 Corinthians or something like that?
2 Corinthians.
2 Corinthians.
Walk into a ball.
But you can't, when people make fun of Pence for refusing to be seen alone, in a restaurant with a woman that's not his wife or something like that, what people in the pew hear is a repudiation of a deeply held core belief that he has about honoring his marriage, about honoring his wife, about his public witness as a believer. And so when you talk about people like some of the people that I grew up with in Oklahoma, or some of my best friend's parents who grew up in white fundamentalism or evangelicalism, the new fundamentalism, I think that it's important to think about the difference and what particular political candidates and or people entrenched in office, what that does portray. And I do think it dovetails with that previous question quite nicely. But because it does get back down to this question of, well, how does that play out? Like, what are the effects? Where you can tell the difference is, where I hope you could tell the difference is a question of when it affects the policy. Like, can you tell a difference between a Jerry Falwell Jr. and a Mike Pence? Jerry Falwell Jr. stands before convocation at Liberty College, e.g. what most Christian schools call chapel, but it's an arena like as large as some small MBA arenas, actually. And he tells every Liberty University college student that if Muslims walked in the room, then they should end their lives with the gun that he has. If everybody was packing what I have in my back pocket, like a gun, you should end them before, we could end them before they end us, in the wake of the San Bernardino shootings, right? Mike Pence wouldn't say that. He doesn't get extra credit because he understood the assignment that he was supposed to go up there and like certify the election, right? But that was his integrity. It was. He wasn't out there. The news came for him. And that's the part where he's speaking from his heart when he talks about turning to his daughter and choosing the right thing, and so I think there's some sifting that can be done. But there's this earnest factor that they have. So does it matter that some of them are earnest and some of them aren't, and some of them really don't want people to die, but if they have to die, like I heard someone say earlier, like maybe that's for the best, for the refiner's fire to come and take these people. But you can be earnest and spend your life studying the law and the Bible in tandem and teach students at Notre Dame and then go to the Supreme Court. But how far does that go when people are literally dying because they can't get a life-saving DNC, right? And so this is where the rubber hits the road, and this is where teasing out these questions does become difficult, and this is what public accountability is for, like electoral accountability. And so they're ripe questions, but I do think there are different ones, they're not all the same. And so I think as social scientists and humanities, we can be guilty, and the media, of dismissing people by placing them under this label or this umbrella of Christian nationalism, right? And so I want to be wary of that. I want to be careful of that as someone who studies these folks and actually cares about like kind of what the consequences are and what the outcomes are of elections and these people assuming places in positions of power, because we see what the policy ramifications are quite clearly right now. The Supreme Court, which is not an elected position, right? But how did they get there?
Bill, thoughts?
I'm not sure I'm going to really be able to communicate this really well, but I want to sort of make a point about a shift in the religious and political culture, and then also just a point about a shift in political style that I think is maybe important. So let's be honest, Mike Pence doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell of becoming president, right? I mean, it's absolutely not going to happen. And the reason for this is that folks want, they're more interested in the fight than the faith. And Mike Pence is a leader of a sort, and this is a shift in style, and this is the shift I'm getting at. Is somebody like Pence or like George W. Bush, for that matter. This is back in the days where the kind of refrain was, we need people, good Christian leaders, people, good moral character, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, obviously those days, are well behind us now. And what you need really is not somebody who is beyond reproach, but you need somebody, if I can almost put it this way, who's beyond good and evil. I mean, somebody who is a figure who can channel cosmic power, almost. And this is partly to do with the kind of increasing prominence of Pentecostals with their talk of kind of spiritual warfare and so on within the Christian nationalist movement. But this is something of a fringe, and so this brings me to this stylistic point, which is one of the things that Trump was really amazing at. It just could never tell whether he meant it. I mean, he has a way of speaking where it's impossible to tell whether he's joking, whether he means it seriously, whether he's just trolling you. And interestingly, I noticed the same thing in this DeSantis ad. I mean, it was a little tongue-in-cheek, you know, on the 8th day, God created a fighter. You really mean that? But I think this is important for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is the kind of obvious reason that it allows, you know, some people say, oh, well, you know, he's only joking. It's not as bad as people are saying. And so it makes it possible to broaden the coalition a little bit. But I think it also provides a kind of a moral alibi for, you know, those people who really are serious Christians, or, you know, understand themselves as such, to vote for the guy. I mean, it creates this sort of, you know, psychological buffer that he doesn't really mean that, and, you know, I don't really think that, and so it's actually okay. So that's my hunch, is look for DeSantis and other would-be Trumps to sort of try to emulate that peculiarity in his style.
Thank you. Excuse me. So I think we got time for probably one more question here. And obviously people can tell that one of my interests, as Miguel put it, is the sort of the packaging and the sort of media narrative that comes with the Christian nationalism and the prognostications and so forth. And one of the things I've loved about the discussion here is that we are bringing in that discussion of the implications for liberals or progressives or the left, right? That it doesn't strictly just break down to a right-wing sort of thing. But so I guess what I want to ask about that is another sort of what I think is a media narrative. And I think, if I had to guess, it goes back to, you know, years and years and years of being accused of having a liberal bias and so forth, where I feel like there's this almost knee-jerk reaction in media presentations to create symmetries where I don't know that they hold. And I'm thinking, you know, right after, as the midterms were ending, so really before most of the results had come out, I was reading things. I saw a piece on CNN talking about how there was an extremism problem on both sides. You know, that this is what exit polling was showing. You have not just people on the far right creating a notion of Antifa as some counterbalance, but you sometimes hear these media voices that I think really want to construct a sense that there are sort of, it's almost like a seesaw, that there are sort of counterbalancing forces on both sides. And my question is that true, right? Can you have a populist leftist movement? Of course. Can you have a nationalist leftist movement? Of course. Can you have authoritarian leftism? Of course you can. Is that really a symmetrical threat, do you think, to American democracy here and now, to what we see with Christian nationalism, which is primarily a phenomenon of the right? The profundity is too profound.
I mean, I think the straightforward point to make is that there's nobody remotely analogous on the left to Donald Trump, who's in charge of the Democratic Party, or who is a prominent leader who, you know, would condone or wink at violence. I mean, this is very clear in the reactions of Democratic leaders to, you know, the rioting that occurred in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, this is just crystal clear. And so, you know, the term that political scientists like Lucy uses, asymmetric polarization. But of course, you know, there is this desire to create a kind of moral equivalence, and also this practice of projection, you know, imagining the other side is already doing what you're planning to do. So that would be my view. But it's very difficult for the media. It is very difficult for the media to handle, just because of the way that you know, that journalism is done, you know, the way that news shows are put together. It's hard.
Other thoughts or impressions on this?
I also think, in general, when it happens, and I do think the media is responsible for quite a bit of this. It's when the claim is made that there's this kind of equivalent left, far left that's tearing the country apart. In general, these claims are patently racist and sexist. And everything else, you know, it's the gays, it's the blacks, it's the squad, who are almost all women, black, of Palestinian descent, Somali American, you know, and so it's bullshit. I mean, we have to call it what it is. It's not studied, it's not thoughtful, it's flippant. It's just like calling everything intersectional and thinking, you know, and then patting yourself on the back, or noticing that you stood in front of me in line, but I was here and you still didn't save me, like, you know. And so again, I think that part of this goes back to, and I would say I would even question the assumptiveness of the future of American democracy. American democracy is patently white supremacist. It's patently settler colonialist and extractor colonialist. And it's built, I mean, I heard someone drop the doctrine of discovery. Well, what's the doctrine of discovery? You know, like, let's go back to the 15th century. And we're not talking about some kind of deconstruction. We're starting with the assumptiveness that the liberal project can be saved. And a question is, can the liberal project be saved? Because the majority of you in this audience want your kids to get into your alma mater. And that is affirmative action, right? And that's white consciousness. And so I'm actually interested in getting to the foundational question of, if white Christian nationalism is inherently white supremacist, well then why the fuck isn't democracy inherently white supremacist? And can we have that conversation? Because until we can have that conversation, we can't talk about inequity, we can't really talk about racism, we can't really talk about sexism or heterosexism or any of the rest of it, because it's predicated on this faux assumption that democracy is working for all of us. And it ain't, and it's not. And so that for me is really kind of also at the heart of that, because the good liberals on MSNBC are doing the both sidesism all the time, as well as the folks on Fox, just as well, maybe better, and people in the academy, just like us. And so for me, it's a real question about our humanity, and an assumptiveness that so-called democracy is going to get us there. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure, honestly.
Thank you. On that note, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
if you want to jump in.
Sorry.
Maybe it's just me, but when I think of this dichotomy of the extreme left and the extreme right, the extreme left seems very moderate to me. They don't really sound like an extreme left. I find them extremely moderate. And I think part of the problem is that one of the things I try to argue is that all Eurocentric theological and philosophical assumptions are detrimental to communities of color. And the reason being, these are philosophical and theological ideas or structures that were developed to exclude the global South. So why do we think that they still work today? And why do we embrace them when, even if we try to reform them, even if we try to update them, even if we try to make them more politically correct, even though we try to bring some voices, you know, have some Latino voices and spice it up or something, it's still on its very core fighting for, or at least based on, the civilization and Christianization of the natives. So when we look at our political structures and we talk about the left and the right, it's still the left and the right of a Eurocentric philosophical theological undergirding that was always meant to exclude the global South. So that conversation of the extreme right and the extreme left seems a little silly to me when I when I think of it from that perspective.
Thank you so much. So I know we could talk further, but I want to give the audience a chance to contribute here. So I want to thank the panelists for responding to these questions. Yeah, we can do a round of applause. That's all right. And then, as we did before, we will, Brad, this time I think will be circulating some, and we'll be doing some online questions. And again, it's just an opportunity to pose questions to the panelists.
Hi. So I want to go back to some of the stuff that you all were talking about in terms of branding for the midterms and branding of Christian nationalism and how that worked. And I'm wondering if you all can speak a little bit about how Roe v. Wade maybe played into that and how we didn't quite see the red wave that was talked about. Roe v. Wade has been the project, like the project for Christian nationalism for 50 years. I don't think we quite saw the victory lap that Christian nationalists were expecting with some of the elections in Kansas and other states. So I'm wondering if you all think that, how much of an influence that had on the midterms? Was that a miscalculation on the part of Christian nationalists in their pursuit of power? And has that maybe pulled back the veil for voters on what the Christian nationalist and far-right agenda really is? And has that maybe been a detriment to that project?
Exit polls showed that abortion access was a significant influence in how people voted, and 37%, like unmarried women went for Democrats, 37%. Like it's the only group, like unmarried men, married men, and married women all went Republican. Unmarried women by 37 percentage points went Democrat. I think it's pretty clear that that was some kind of an influence. Now, I don't know how, I don't know how much abortion access determined each one of these things, but because so many of them were tight elections, I think any significant shift in public opinion that might have led people to vote a different direction, I mean, it had an effect in some way. So I think that contributed to the loss. Now, would Christian nationalists say, "Oh, we learned our lessons, we shouldn't have gone that so hard"? No, I think they would have exchanged it in a second because they've got Supreme Court justices. They can do that forever now. So I think they would still say, hey, short term, these people are pretty good at thinking the long game. And so one kind of disappointing midterm is not going to dissuade them from their goal, even though I think it might have cost them in the midterm for sure.
From general confused and surprised that the red wave didn't happen. We're blaming Gen Z, unmarried women, and youth leadership, but there's not a lot of talk about COVID and the fact that their behaviors around COVID, in fact, killed a lot of their base or disabled a lot of their base. So how much do you think that COVID impacted this election, and what can we learn about that as a Christian nationalism denial and leaders?
I mean, I think it's going to be a while before the public health and political science folks have really sorted this out. I will say that somebody sent me a spreadsheet that they had put together very quickly following the election that looked at COVID death in every county in Pennsylvania and made a sort of back of the napkin calculation about how much that had moved the dial. And in some cases, for example, the Fetterman versus Oz race, that were somewhat closer, may well have been the margin, in fact. There was this talk that sounded hyperbolic at the time about Trump killing his own voters. Well, maybe it wasn't so hyperbolic.
Although I wonder, what we do know is that the vast majority of people disproportionately who died of COVID were Black and brown people, specifically service workers. And once the vaccine came out, they were among the last to get it. Again, I don't know what the numbers are, and we'll have to wait for that, but I just want to put a caveat. I mean, to be careful, because it's not just Trump's base that died. It was the underside of this country that experienced the bulk, disproportionately, of deaths.
So Paxton and a few other authors have kind of noticed that fascism tends to go out two different ways. You sort of have the Germany, Italy, Japan way of we finally run out of bodies and blood and just run out of people. And then you kind of have the Spanish way with Franco, where it more normalizes into a more like authoritarian conservatism. And so with this election and the way things look to be trending, if you had to make a projection for 2024, but also beyond, which way do you think the Christian nationalism and fascist movement within America is trending now?
I guess I'm having a problem. I'm not quite sure I understand the question, because when you say Franco's Spain, it was extremely bloody as well. So I'm not quite sure if there's much of a difference. Maybe I'm missing something.
I think while you were talking about fascism on the way out, I think this one's on the way up. So like I don't see I think we're going this way. And by that I don't necessarily mean kind of like the majority of Americans radicalizing. I mean in terms of the political hardball that we're seeing, like the erosion of democratic norms among far right leaders with impunity. The support to kind of like undercut elections and question, and to the point where, like, I mean, if you are paying attention to kind of the discourse around a lot of these close elections, it is getting to the point where election denial is becoming a part of the Republican identity. Like every time we lose a close one, we will always lean hard into election denial. Why? Well, to change election laws, to make it more difficult for certain populations that keep defeating us to vote, to drill down hard into patriarchy again, and to talk about like women need to get married and need husbands to kind of correct their emotional decisions for the leftists. And so like I think the fascist kind of like discourse and trend, I think is only on the rise. So I don't even think we've had a chance to see kind of like how this is going to take shape in the future, let alone go out. Does that make sense? Yeah.
This is a question about the, thank you. A question about the rise of the nuns in millennials and Gen Z, and connecting it with, I guess you would call it secular Christian nationalism, because I personally would equate a Theo Bro reply guy with an Elon Musk reply guy. There's some overlap there. So what, how does the secular side of this relate to the white Christian nationalism discussion?
It's kind of two-part. I will give just a quick two-part answer. So, first of all, the rise of the nuns is, to a very large extent, driven by the kind of death embrace between the white Christian nationalist right and the Republican Party. Young people say, well, I'm progressive, and being Christian means being reactionary, and so I guess I don't want to have anything to do with that. So that and this is just one of the ironies of this is this just repeats a very old pattern, that really was the main mechanism behind the de-Christianization of most of Western Europe. I think part of what's going on is what Larissa was talking about earlier, is just that evangelical has become a kind of a political label. Of course, the other thing that is going on is people who are just straight up secular white nationalists are basically hiding behind the Christian nationalist label. And they're doing this very strategically. This is nothing new. This is what the white supremacist movement has always done as a way of trying to sort of inject their ideas into the mainstream. And, it sounds somewhat better to say I'm defending, Judeo-Christian civilization or something of that sort than to say I'm defending the white race, I'm fighting against white genocide, or something that's just explicitly, sounds like the KKK, which is, what most people think of when they think of white nationalism.
So I've sat through 2 panels in Colorado, and nobody's talked about furries and litter boxes. I'm quite disappointed. The serious question is, how does two-part, how does conspiracy thinking fit into white Christian nationalism? And how do we think about the entities that are manipulating these stories to generate the anxiety and the response and the perceived threat among the Christian nationalist groups?
So there are, if I can sort of put it somewhat boldly, kind of post-millennial or premillennialism is kind of the mother of all conspiracy theories, right? That there are sort of hidden invisible forces operating, and I have this secret knowledge and I can somehow foresee the future. And, there's also a kind of a revenge porn element, to say QAnon and also to premillennialism. I think that's part of that's part of the attraction. Another piece of this that has to be said is just anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism is at the root of so many of the kind of conspiracy tropes that are popping up again, and they're at the core of QAnon. I'm not pointing out anything new, but I just think it's important to underline that connection, and that it's not just like, oh, that's where it came from, but it's disconnected from that. Not at all. For some people, these conspiracy theories are also just a way of, making anti-Semitism seem sexy or interesting.
Ready for another one?
I'm debating if I should jump in and say something. Well, you mentioned, the apocalypse and that's, and what I find fascinating is that this white Christian nationalism has a tremendous support for Israel. And at the same time, in the biblical text, at the end of the story, all Jews die in the lake of fire. So the friends of Israel, these white Christian nationalism, have a final solution wrapped into their very theology. And then those who instead look at Israel and hold it accountable for the way it is treating Palestinians become the anti-Semites. So we're living in an interesting time in where it just doesn't make sense to me theologically that the white Christian nationalism in this country and the white Jewish nationalism in Israel are kin, even though at the end of the story there is a Holocaust that's going to occur to the Jews. And maybe their real friends are Christians who want to hold them accountable for the treatment of the Palestinians.
Christian Zionism is the expansion pack for white Christian nationalism. I mean, the way that it works. I mean, it's really very straightforward. And I mean, I think you can sort of you can best understand this if you think about the double bind catch-22 that it puts American Jews in. So, if you are a Jew, Israel is your country. Like, Donald Trump has said this very openly. A lot of people have said this. That's your country, but that means America can't be your country. But because America is your country, Israel is also. This was just a very good illustration of how this works. And there's nothing specifically American about this. The same shell game is being played all over Europe right now as we speak.
It's a good thing you went there because that's what I was going to ask. So I had to pick a different question. How does the American two-party system feed into or interact with white Christian nationalism's rhetoric of good versus evil and the common Pentecostal rhetoric of spiritual warfare?
I'll just take a very quick stab at this. So there's definitely a similarity, but I think there's also an important difference. So if you think about the kind of, pre-tribulationist, just premillennial dispensationalism, it's a political ethic of passive and watchful waiting. Everybody's going to get their comeuppance in the end. But there's nothing you can do between now and then except kind of fill the lifeboats, right? But this sort of new, the kind of dominionist post-millennial version of eschatology, it's not watchful waiting. I mean, the idea is, right, that Christians must take dominion, they must conquer the seven mountains, and then and only then will Christ return. But this gives you then an active role to play. This is, kind of gives you, it holds out the temptation of, forcing the end. And so in a way, it's sort of the best and the worst of both post-millennial and premillennial eschatology.
I would just add, I think Americans' religious and political identities have sorted, and they've increasingly sorted rather neatly. I was just showing my sociology students this past week, in fact, that over time, in the 1970s, you had basically equal percentage of evangelical Democrats as evangelical Republicans. That is not the case today, right? Where you've got over 40% of Republicans are white evangelicals, and less than, or probably around 15% of Democrats are evangelicals. So you've got a huge disparity. And 80% of Republicans are white Christians. So when religious identities and political identities sort so neatly, it becomes very easy for like the biblical kind of us versus them to overlap onto your political party identities. Does that make sense? So who are the people of God? Well, it's obviously the Republicans, as that's where most of these kinds of like conservative white Christians are. Who are the enemies? Well, it's where the woke lefty secular liberals and the people of color are. So like that's, it makes it really neat to be able to kind of to say who is the us versus them. Whereas in previous decades, it would have been more difficult. It would have been more difficult for political leaders to do that. But now it is a lot easier for, say, Republican politicians to even use that rhetoric, assuming that everybody knows when we talk about our people as Republicans, we're talking about Christians, we're talking about people like us, talking about people who share our values, and who are the bad guys? Well, it's like Catherine was DeSantis, Ephesians 6, stand strong against the left's schemes, right, instead of the devil's schemes. That only makes sense in a context where you're pretty sure that everybody who is a Democrat is a woke, secular, lefty commie, right?
On that note,
yeah,
I want to again thank our panelists, both from the first panel and for the second panel. Thank you so much. I want to wind down the evening by thanking all of you for joining us, those of you who are here in person, and it's exciting to do things in person again. That still feels really nice, as well as everybody who is live streaming. So thank you to all of you, to Brad and Sarah for putting this together, and I think another round of applause for our panelists.
All right, couple of announcements. If you'd like to have an adult beverage and hang out, we're going to go to Platt Park Brewing, okay? So Platt Park Brewing. So if you can stay up past your bedtime and talk more about all these incredibly cheery, jovial topics, then come do it, okay? We're going to hang around for a minute. All of us who were here, we're going to take a picture real quick, but then be a chance maybe to ask someone a question or have a comment or two. And other than that, just as Dan said, so thankful for y'all being here, making this happen, and everyone watching online, thankful for you too. We'll see you next time.